Hello. For the freshest episode of the incessant A is for Architecture podcast, I spoke to Adam Sharr, Professor of Architecture at Newcastle University, to discuss his very old book, Heidegger for Architects, published by Routledge in 2007. Heidegger is politely called a controversial figure because he was a member of the Nazi Party between 1933 and 1945. That's a lot to deal with, for sure, and getting beyond it might seem rather unnecessary. However, Heidegger's ideas haunt architectural discourse, design practice, and education, which, whilst publicly denouncing his various entanglements, remains inwardly wedded to descriptions of concepts like dwelling, place, authenticity, and building that are rooted in his work. Arguably, his ideas remain foundational in debates on sustainability and human-centered design too. Heidegger suggested buildings participate in the unfolding of place and meaning, and presented complex but rich ideas about what it means to think of architecture not just as the production of objects, but as a way of revealing or concealing our relationship to the world around us. So, an awkward chat, I guess, but a good one.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the A is for Architecture podcast. I'm delighted to be talking today to Professor Adam Sharr. Adam, thank you so much for joining me. I wrote to you a while back to ask if we could talk about your book from 2007, I think it is, Heidegger for Architects, which you published with Routledge. And you very kindly agreed to return to it almost 20 years after the act. So I'm very excited to be talking about that. Obviously, Heidegger is important to all of us as far as we understand him, and hopefully you will spread a bit more light on that as we go. But before we do that, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself, please?
Of course, yes. So I'm Adam Sharr. I'm Professor of Architecture at Newcastle University. I'm series editor of the series of books called Thinkers for Architects, which Heidegger for Architects is in. And I think I've done either written or co-edited 8 books on architecture now. The first 2 on Heidegger, although, as you say, it's quite a long time since I wrote that book. I read it again last night to remind myself. I think it's still all right. My turn of phrases may be a bit less florid these days, but so it's wonderful to have the opportunity to be here and to revisit the work again. I suppose it's worth saying that I have left Heidegger behind in my own scholarship, partly because I'm interested in other things now, but also partly, and I guess we'll come on to this, because more has come to light about Heidegger's involvement with Nazism in the 1930s, and which I didn't know when I was working on those books originally, and I kind of feel like I need a pause, maybe a long pause.
I'm interested to hear about this. I mentioned Heidegger and this podcast recording with you to my wife, and we did laugh rather a lot about the way that he as a particular character has been absolved of his engagement with Nazism. I don't understand it and I haven't read around it, so I would be very interested to hear about that. But I guess a better place to start, or an important place to start, is trying to understand who he was. What was his lineage? What was the context he grew up in? And importantly for this, what was his lineage as a philosopher?
Sure. So Heidegger was born in 1889 in a small town in southern Germany called Meßkirch. And his father was a barrel maker, but also sexton to the local church, which was across the road from the house that they lived in. So he grew up as a choir boy and as a bell ringer, living life according to the kind of calendar of feasts and festivals of the church associated with the seasons. And he began training through church grants towards the priesthood, first of all.
This was Lutheranism?
Actually, no, he was a Catholic.
Okay.
So what was going on at that time in Germany in terms of the kind of situation, or in that part of Germany, was that there's, I suppose, a kind of powerful national Protestant majority, but also a kind of old Catholic group who were what were called Old Catholics, who were also kind of dominant in that region, whereas they were from a Roman Catholic family. So, I mean, the whole kind of church politics was quite complex at that point in that place, or certainly as when Heidegger was little. He then shifted from studying theology to philosophy at the university in Freiburg, and but kind of took with him, I suppose, a preoccupation around the question of being, of why we're here. I suppose what we as a parent, I kind of find very hard to explain to children, my boy, or to children when they ask. Parents find that question, why are we here? I don't know. But Heidegger preferred the formulation that he got from Leibniz, which is a kind of negative way of expressing the question of being. So why is there not nothing? And that preoccupation of being runs all the way through Heidegger's work, and it's effectively the kind of central project of his philosophy. He studied phenomenology with Edmund Husserl, whose book Logical Investigations effectively launched modern phenomenology, drawing from ideas from Hegel a few generations before. But Heidegger made phenomenology his own through his particular project. I guess as a key part of his personal mythology. So in 1923, at the point that he was kind of really beginning his career as an academic, as a philosopher, he got a job in Marburg, distant from Freiburg, but he, to kind of maintain connection with that region of southern Germany, he built a mountain hut, which was the subject of my PhD and then a book. And it was a place where he thought and wrote for most of his life. And he gradually came to imagine his philosophy as philosophy seen from the mountainside. He lived a kind of routine of subsistence life at the hut, fetching water from the well, cooking on a tiny stove, so there's this kind of romance that Heidegger is constructed around Heidegger, but Heidegger also is part of constructing about himself as the sort of solitary scribe on the mountain, and he writes later in his life about his philosophy almost being the kind of the philosophy of the landscape being translated through him, as though he's just the scribe, kind of recording the sense of the fundamental sense of presence of the landscape and the kind of the mystical sense of where the kind of drama of mountain weather comes from, a deeply embodied sense of being in the place. So there's the hut that's kind of part of his mythology from the 1920s. The most difficult part of his life, and which for many invalidates his philosophy entirely, was his rectorate of Freiburg University from 1933 to 34. So he, at the point that the Nazis came to power in Germany, he was appointed rector of the university. And as part of that, he implemented some party rules, which included laws restricting the access of Jews, including Husserl, who was his teacher, who was Jewish. And he gave a couple of speeches where he mixed his philosophical vocabulary with Nazi rhetoric. And so Heidegger wrote an apologia about his time as rector much later in life, in 1985, when he argues that when his rectorate came to an end in 1934, it marked his kind of disillusionment with the regime, and that he spent the rest of the Nazi era in kind of quiet resistance, working up at the hut and so on. But it's become increasingly clear that he held some pretty poisonous views. So some of his notebooks from that period were published in 2014, called the Black Notebooks, and in there are some anti-Semitic remarks, I suppose when I was working on Heidegger back in the late 1990s, there were people who would argue that we shouldn't pay attention to him, he's a Nazi philosopher. There were others who were saying, well, he became disillusioned, and so and also arguing that you can to some extent detach the biography of the philosopher from the philosophy. But I think it's become clearer since I was working on those books that there are some more many more difficult questions for the people who would defend Heidegger's work to answer. Post World War II, he retreated to his mountain hut. He was forcibly retired from the university in 1945 because of his involvement with the Nazi regime and pensioned. He was also banned from teaching until 1950. And when that ban was lifted, the essay Building Dwelling Thinking, which architects know, and I guess is most and is the essay where he really talks about architecture, was written in 1951 and as part of a group of essays that were really the beginning of his re-emergence and rehabilitation after that period. So in his later work, he allowed the cultivation of an image of himself as some kind of solitary mystic, working up at the hut, interested in Eastern philosophy, the Tao Te Ching in particular, influencing his work, and the pre-Socratic, so the very oldest fragments of Western philosophy. And also becoming really interested in etymology, in the ancient meanings of words, and what we might learn from the histories of words. He argued that came to argue that it's not so much us that speak language as language that speaks us, and he started looking for ancient insights into being through the long histories of words. And he retired. He worked pretty much until he died, which was in 1976, and he was buried in Meschkirch, the town where he grew up. And he asked to be buried with some branches from the forest and the wind wheel that was outside the window, the wind chime that was outside the window of his hut. And so almost kind of coming back full circle in some respects to where he began.
Thank you. That's really good context. It's sort of difficult, I guess, at the moment that you discover an important thinker like this has this unfortunate, shall we say, association with some pretty awful people.
Say the least, yeah.
It becomes difficult to sort of, I guess, justify the continued interest in him. But we do remain interested in Heidegger, and Heidegger remains fundamental, I think, in significant parts of architectural discourse and thinking, and even in the way that we teach it still, particularly around this issue of phenomenology. Could you talk a little bit about this? Now, we're kind of jumping around in the notes that I sent you, but I suppose it would be very useful to understand what a Heideggerian phenomenology is, because perhaps that's one way of rehabilitating his thinking, if not the man himself.
Yes. I mean, I wonder if, just to the kind of earlier point of that, I wonder whether the way to think about Heidegger in architecture now is really as part of architecture's intellectual history, to recognise his influence in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, but maybe to think of his work as being something that has that legacy in architectural thinking but belongs in the past. Anyway, so to introduce phenomenology, so one of Heidegger's biographers, a guy called Rudiger Safransky, describes phenomenology as studying the laws of free fall whilst falling. So yeah, what does that mean? Well, I guess the typical way of thinking about the world around us in Anglo-American philosophy is to imagine objects, and philosophers use the examples of a tree or a table often, as being things that are external to us, that we're able, that they exist as objects but also as pure forms which we're able to access by thinking about them. Whereas for phenomenology, for Heideggerian phenomenology, we're always already there in the world before we start thinking about it. So we're never detached from the world as an outside observer of the things that we're thinking about. We're always already observing the world from a position within it. So that sounds like quite a pedantic distinction, but it has some quite important consequences. So if we imagine ourselves as only ever thinking about the world from a position of already being within it, then it tends to privilege embodiment and experience as a way of understanding. that we understand the world outwards from ourselves. And in phenomenology, subjectivity becomes more important than objectivity, that we understand the world outwards from our own subjectivity. So I guess in a university context, and particularly as designers, where design decisions are often can be, or at least often can be imagined as subjective, are subjective, an intellectual framework which values the subjective seems valuable, and becomes a way of, I suppose, trying to study and make sense of and validate judgment and the decision making that comes from an embodied experience and understanding of the world. I guess in architecture, phenomenology tends to lead us towards understanding architecture not in terms of decoration, as we might have done in the 19th century, or function in the 20th, but instead privileging ideas about what it's like to be in a space. What does it feel like to be somewhere? How can architecture foster a rich sense of inhabitation? So, to make engaging spaces that people want to be in and invite people to inhabit them. Perhaps also thinking about mood and atmosphere of spaces. Peter Zumthor, who's very interested in phenomenology, has written a book called Atmospheres. I guess there's also potentially a problematic dimension to it as well. So there's a tendency, I think, with phenomenological thinking to assume as an architect, as a writer, as a thinker, as an individual, that our experience can somehow be universal, that as individual people experiencing the world, what we experience is what other people experience. And there's been a lot of work done more recently around phenomenology. So, for example, Sharr Ahmed's book, Queer Phenomenology, which is looking at what some people might call other subjectivities. So, thinking about the world from or recognizing the validity of people's experiences who are not normally included in the academy or in the professions or so on. So I think there can be a tendency for, I don't know, particularly phenomenologists who are perhaps Western white men to assume that their experience is somehow universal, and more recent scholarship is really interested in recognizing a diversity of experiences and not making that automatic assumption that just because I feel a certain way in a space that other people will do the same.
Where do we see in Heidegger's work the investigation or interrogation of this idea of the integration of the human person and the world beyond us into a kind of holistic oneness? How does he explore this idea? There's this notion in your book that you talk about of the thing, and I was wondering if you could talk a little to that idea. Where do we encounter this most clearly?
So the most famous of Heidegger's essays from an architect's perspective, which I already mentioned, is this talk called Building Dwelling Thinking, which was a talk that he gave to an audience of architects and philosophers, sociologists, at a conference called Man and Space, Mensch und Raum in Darmstadt in 1951. And the context of that conference was around what was then called the dwelling question, the Wohnungsfrage. So the problem of lack of housing in what was then West Germany, following World War II, following destruction, refugees arriving from the East and so on. And Heidegger set the essay up as a critique of a technocratic way of thinking about dwelling. So one of the consequences of Heidegger's emphasis on being is a long-standing critique of technology and the way that technology and technological modernity, he felt, was distancing people from more traditional, more human, he felt, ways of being in the world. And so he challenged this kind of massive house building project and the way that it was described in terms of numbers and quantities. You have to produce this many houses, and also he challenged the involvement of professionals. He felt that professionals like architects were part of the problem, part of the kind of technological infrastructure that was only thinking of housing in terms of quantities and functions and so on. And so the essay Building Dwelling Thinking begins by going to etymology, to the old meanings of words, to talk about building and dwelling. And he traces the histories of those words back in Old High German to suggest that they once had the same root, that they were once the same word. It might have been a bit of a kind of opportunistic tracing of the etymology. Heidegger also noticed that there was a connection between the verb for building, bauen, and the name of a farmer, der Bauer. So there's this idea that building and dwelling not only were once the same thing, but were connected through the idea of caring for the land and caring for the world around us. So he then goes on to an example of the bridge. So there are two examples in the essay, and he talks about the bridge in terms of placemaking. So the idea of a bridge being built across a river, and that the place of the bridge wasn't there until the bridge was built. And he's interested in how the bridge kind of gathers human activity around it. It makes a place where there wasn't previously one. And he also talks about the bridge as a built thing. So as part of this suite of essays that he wrote, 3 essays around the time of Building Dwelling Thinking, there's another one called The Thing, which defines the idea of a thing as something which we know through our own experience, as opposed to the conventional Anglo-American idea of the object in philosophy, which is something which is external to us, which we can only make contact with through the idea of kind of pure forms and sensible forms. So he talks about the bridge as a thing because it's able to gather human life experience around it, I guess. And he goes, so the architect Aldo van Eyck in the 1960s, Aldo van Eyck was good for aphorisms, and one of his best ones, or most useful ones for this context anyway, is the line, "Whatever space and time mean, place and occasion mean more." And I think Van Eyck, who read Heidegger, was getting at the idea that space and time, these constructs that come from a kind of more abstract way of seeing the world, have limitations, and that if you instead think about place and occasion, you think about how humans experience the world, how we identify with a place. We know places through our memory and our imagination and our sense of being there, and the idea of occasion as being kind of more than just time. Again, that it's something that a way of thinking about time through experience and memory and embodied knowledge, and so on. So place becomes really important then, and is related to this notion of objects as buildings, as being built things, that our knowledge of them is rooted in experience. And then I guess Heidegger ends that essay with an example of a Black Forest farmhouse. So the Black Forest, it's not about gatto and cherries, but the Heidegger's hut was in the Black Forest mountains of southern Germany, and so he's really writing about, to some extent, about his own life at the hut, but also about life in the traditional farmhouses of the village near where he was writing. And Black Forest farmhouses tend to have they're big buildings with a deep overhanging roof, which is about shedding snow. So probably I don't know, 2/3 of the height of the building often is steeply pitched roof. The houses are often built into the bank for insulation, and they're often part house and part barn. So the animals would stay in the barn part of the house in the winter and would help to warm up the house. So what I guess as architects we now think of as being kind of passive environmental design in terms of insulation and heating. And Heidegger wrote about the Black Forest farmhouse in terms of the rites and the rituals of agricultural life, and thinking about the dwelling of people in this house. He had the idea that the house set out how people would live there, but also the ways that people live set out how the house was organised. So he was really interested in the rites and rituals of everyday life. And I guess that goes back perhaps to his Catholic childhood and involvement with the kind of rites and rituals of the Catholic calendar. So he talks about the house in terms of sacred places, the dining table, which I guess would kind of count out the life of the house in meals, the altar nook behind it with the icon in, which kind of then related that to, I suppose, kind of broader ideas of the human place, traditional human place in the world, and cosmology. And he talked about the child bed and the coffin rest. So this idea that that a new child arriving in the house is a sacred thing, but also recognizing people who die there. And so he's kind of talks about the house as a sort of physical and social micro-organization in relation to the landscape, in relation to climate. And he imagined this as an example, the Black Forest farmhouse, of how it was once possible to build and dwell as though they were the same thing. But he argued that it was I mean, it's in a way, it's a very conservative and kind of argument. But he argued that, and there's sort of romantic dimensions to it, I guess. But he argued that that was a world that was lost, that it couldn't be reclaimed in the present when he was writing in 1951. But that idea of building and dwelling as being the same thing should be reclaimed somehow in a new way. And I guess some of the problems with it, along with the romanticism, I guess, is that Heidegger was very keen on promoting the Black Forest farmhouse as being an authentic way of life, that this is how we should live. And various critiques of Heidegger, not least Theodor Adorno, writing in the 1960s, really criticised this idea of authenticity, that also if there's an authentic way of life, then there's also an inauthentic way of life. And if there are people who live authentically, there are presumably people who also live inauthentically. So it becomes a way of potentially a kind of source of exclusion. And ultimately, the potentially saying that people who don't dwell somehow authentically are other, that they don't belong, and that way are the kind of seeds of racism and totalitarianism.
It's also an absurdity, isn't it? I mean, it's just technically an absurdity to talk about an inauthentic life versus an authentic life. I mean, it strikes me as having sort of very weak foundations as an idea.
Yeah. I mean, and it's a way, I suppose, of imposing a certain kind of taste or value systems on others by claiming these people are authentic, and not so much.
But I think that's exactly right. I think the word taste is exactly right there. It feels to me like an aesthetic choice, and like inauthenticity is that which we find unaesthetic or to some degree gross to look at.
I guess, yeah. I mean, and it's easy to read it that way from an architect's perspective. I suppose Heideggerians would argue that that in the context of Heidegger's work on technology, what he's doing is to argue that technology has intervened between humans and the natural and cosmological rhythms of life and the planet. Technology has inserted itself in that gap in between, and that what Heidegger was trying to do with his philosophical project, at least to some extent, and what many architectural Heideggerians have tried to do, is to think about how to reclaim a way of understanding the world which goes back to pre-technological ways of understanding the world, before natural philosophy became modern science, and the present, so that somehow we might be able to find a new way of being in conjunction with the planet and with the landscape and so on. So that would be their way of putting it. But so they would disagree with that idea that it's an aesthetic point. But I have some sympathy with with the argument.
Yes. But this point that you're making about this kind of more integrated, more unified and cosmological way of being is reflected in his idea of, in Heidegger's idea of the fourfold, which, as I understand it, is a sort of a way of thinking about the relational character of place, this relationship between earth, sky, mortals, and divinities. So there's a very deeply kind of spiritualistic kind of quality to this. Could you talk a little bit about this idea of the fourfold?
Sure. I mean, it's strange, and
I mean, what's his point? What's he trying to get to with it?
yeah, yeah. So he's saying that. So this is in the three essays that I mentioned: building, dwelling, thinking, the thing, and poetically man dwells, which was the other one. This trio of essays that he wrote in 1950 and 51. This idea of the fourfold appears in all of them, and it's his way of describing or trying to account for the fundamental conditions of being in the world, of what it's like to experience the world. And he argues that we live with earth, sky, divinities, and mortals. And so earth is the land on which we dwell, but also thinking of the earth as the planet, as the source of our water and food and the things with which we live. The sky, obviously, what's above us. So the horizon between earth and sky becomes important. But in German, Himmel, sky is also the word for heaven. So it's thinking about spirituality, cosmology, the idea that as individuals, as experiencing individuals, we belong in a world which is greater than ourselves, which has dimensions to it which we don't understand. Divinities then is a sort of tricky one, because so Gadamer, Hans-Georg Gadamer, another famous philosopher who worked with Heidegger, talks about Heidegger's interpretation of the divinities as the fled gods, the absence of the divine. And there are people in theology, as I understand it, who've interpreted this idea of the absence of gods in Heidegger in relation to I think what's called negative theology. I'm not completely clear about this, but the idea that we know in theology that God can be known through God's absence. And so I think there's something kind of going on there about presence and absence. So Heidegger, I think, was trying somehow to recast spirituality as a fundamental sense of awe at our being in the world, but potentially then without all the politics of established sects and religions. It's a kind of back to first principles idea of religion, I suppose. And I wonder whether there was a book published in 1949 by Messire Eliade called Patterns in Comparative Religion, which is broadly structuralist, not phenomenological in orientation, which is to say it looks, like other structuralists, looking at kind of structural patterns in the world and structural patterns in human behaviour. So Eliade tried to compare global religions, not a small project this, compare global religions in order to try to discern the patterns that connected them together. So to try and look at, I suppose, the sort of structural basis of human spirituality in the ways that humans have thought about what is beyond us. And I wonder whether you can see the divinities, Heidegger's divinities, as being in that kind of context, as a as a way of imagining spirituality without the structures of established religions.
Mm.
And then I guess mortals is us, the people on earth, under the sky, but recognizing that the cycles of life and death, and that I guess I recognize this as I get older. We're only on this planet for a relatively short space of time compared to the
A
planet
tree.
itself. Yeah. So this weird idea of the divinities then becomes the structure, a kind of structure, a framework maybe is a better word, through which we are able to experience and therefore to know things and the world and architecture.
It's it's fascinating. I mean, and it comes back to this idea that you spoke about, the very fact of Heidegger living in his Thoreau-like hut, and this kind of desire to reconnect with the world seems to me to be a fundamentally anti-modernist, and has that legacy, which you can understand in the context of someone having experienced the carnage of the the first half of the 20th century, and absolute insanity and mechanized violence. So I kind of feel for the guy in a little way.
Yeah, and I suppose you can see it, the fourfold, you can imagine it as being an idea of the world of the mountains that he saw out of the window above his desk. That when you're out in the mountain landscape, I mean, it's an amazing place. I've been to visit Tottenhauberg, where the hut was, and there's a real, on the higher paths in the mountains, there's a real sense of meteorological drama. You can see the rain coming towards you. Um, the sun lifts in the summer will lift moisture off the hillsides as steam. And sometimes, being in a place where I looked down from a path into two valleys, and there was cloud in one and sunshine in the other. And so there's this amazing sense in the mountains, I guess, of being in a kind of I don't know, or a sort of I suppose Heidegger would have thought of it as a kind of elemental experience of the world. And I guess you can understand earth, sky, divinities, and mortals more easily if you're imagining it as being stood on a path in the mountains. It's the fundamental conditions of what's around you at that point. I mean, I guess the critique of that would be that, particularly Heidegger writing at this point after the terror of mechanized warfare, after genocide, the Holocaust, and so on, is that he's kind of withdrawing to the hut and this sort of universalized idea of the fundamental preconditions of existence, in a way which I suppose both allows for a sense of what it must have been like to have experienced some of that horror and terror, but also kind of allows you to forget it, because it makes it, it produces this kind of long, it reflect it. I mean, as I guess philosophers do, it deals in a kind of sense of long continuity of human life and experience. And some of the critics of Heidegger would argue, I guess, that this sort of retreat to the mountain world and so on allows you to romanticize and to forget about the horrors of war and destruction and death and so on.
And is it, in the sort of Merleau-Ponty kind of way, his phenomenology, is it about a kind of understanding of the world in a more, as I understand Merleau-Ponty from a conversation I had with Jonathan Hale, who wrote Merleau-Ponty for Architects in your series.
A very good book. Yeah.
Very good book, but Merleau-Ponty, who didn't directly address architecture himself, but this idea that architecture is an immanent property of a sort of way of engaging with the world, that we encounter space sensorily and, as you said, in an embodied way. But what Heidegger seems to be doing is then, rather than leaving it there and saying, that's you and your interpretation and that's correct, he seems to be trying to universalize this, which is a sort of, again, a fascinating slight paradox insofar as it seems to apply a kind of a modernist desire for universalism to a pre-modern idea, or what he sees to be a pre-modern idea.
Yeah, maybe. Although I think he would see the long history of the philosophical project as being trying to discern the what it means to be in the world. And that, for him, this question of being is the most important question. Everything else is a sub-question to this question of being. Why is there not nothing?
Yes.
And so I guess he wouldn't imagine that universalizing as being part of the modern project, that it would be part of a much longer history of philosophy, which ought to be about the problem of being and trying to get to grips with that in one way or another.
Do you think some of these concepts have meaning for contemporary architects in a pliable sense? And I use that word because it's very clear to me that a lot of the discourse that we currently have, particularly around ecology and sustainability, but also around, say, for example, the need for children to be able to play in the city, or the right to green space in urban spaces, or more importantly, getting our hands dirty or having our children play in muddy puddles like we all did apparently when we were children. There seems to me to be kind of like we've rejected Heidegger, the person, but actually Heideggerian thinking has become more dominant still. And it sort of is, we're awash with it, actually. I'm interested both in what you think about that, but also in how then we apply Heideggerian thinking, if we're to want to. How would one go about, and who has done it, I suppose, beyond Zumpfer?
Yeah. So I suppose the first part of the question about, I suppose, broadly about environmentalism and the climate emergency and so on. So there was a play by Elfriede Jelinek, playwright called Tottenauberg. So taking the location of Heidegger's hut, Tottenauberg, and combining it with dead Tottenauberg. But she, in that play, kind of satirizes the way that Heideggerian vocabulary is present in, or was present at that time. I can't remember. She wrote it about 1999 or something. Present in German environmentalism. I guess this is anyone who's been to Germany will know you have 8 bins to recycle things in, and you get shouted at if you put stuff in the wrong bin. And it's a culture that's very proud of its environmental credentials and takes sustainability in many ways very seriously. And so I think what that play picks up is this kind of contradiction, I suppose, between, on the one hand, as you say, the rejection, or a sense that maybe we need to be very cautious about Heidegger's work, but also, on the other hand, some of the lessons from it, which can be very useful. And I suppose the wider environmental movement, which in many ways would seem aligned with some of the themes from Heidegger about being attuned more closely to the planet, living in harmony with the land, trying not to exploit, not to consume more than our due share. And so I think there are some tricky things to puzzle through there about, on the one hand, some of the difficulties associated with Heidegger himself, also the problems of authenticity and exclusion that potentially come out of a kind of Heideggerianism, but also, on the other hand, the urgent need to act in terms of our climate emergency and how we might think about living in a way where we where we're able to live in more harmoniously with the world around us.
Architecture is an increasingly globalized discipline. We have this kind of fundamentally internationalist perspective. Our materials are produced globally. We have regulations that are universalized quite readily, if only in the production of materials. Plasterboard produced in one part of the world has to meet regulations in another part of the world, and so on and so forth. So there's this kind of universalization, which is complicated. And then we've also got this ever-present need for functional innovation. How does a Heideggerian perspective work in that context? Is it possible to have something that's rooted and situated in the way that building dwelling thinking, for example, suggests, that also then squares the circle and facilitates the modern project or the contemporary and all of its fruits? Emancipation, enlightenment, extension of the franchise, and so on and so forth.
Not a small question.
They never are. They never are.
So in terms of the globalization of the building industry, I guess there are plenty of architects already who are thinking about the local sourcing of materials, about reusing materials. People like Rota in Belgium working on urban mining, for example. So thinking about how we can disassemble buildings to reuse materials. So there are plenty of people already thinking about that idea of how we might reduce the embodied carbon of materials by sourcing locally and by transporting things less distance. But I mean, also, I suppose, thinking about the embodied carbon of materials themselves. So, which typically actually often means returning to old materials. So old materials become new materials. So building with stone bricks, for example, becoming fashionable. Pre-stressed stone beams in lieu of concrete. Timber frame construction becoming more popular. And so trying to work with renewable materials. I'm personally really interested in cork as a material because that can potentially become, because of the amount of, it comes from trees in a renewable way, which absorb carbon. Before you transport it anywhere, at least it's potentially a carbon negative material. So I guess there are lots of people who are thinking about construction in that way. Though it becomes more complicated, I guess a lot of people will have come across Kenneth Frampton's essay about critical regionalism, which is often associated with Heidegger. Frampton had written about Heidegger, written in the 1990s, and Frampton talks about the idea of resisting global modernity by claiming a new regionalism. And he has his favoured architects who he thinks are good examples, like Alvar Aalto and Alvaro Siza and so on. But Frampton's essay, I reread it again recently for the first time in about 20 years, and it does get dangerously close to blood and soil in the same way that you can make those claims about Heidegger. And so I think we have to be careful about ideas of regionalism. I mean, and also particularly in a world where we're becoming much more conscious of colonization, the forces of colonialism and extraction, and the power structures involved. Interestingly, the cultures that are most interested in regionalism now tend to be kind of minority nations. So Catalonia, the Basque Country, post-apartheid South Africa, there are people who are really interested in regionalism or regionalisms. And so I guess there's that, on the one hand, there's a question about how we might think locally in order to understand and work with place and planet and locality. But on the other hand, not to impose some kind of closed mindset, which becomes exclusionary. You know, that the idea of the kind of restrictive idea of regionalism where we have to return to some past romance of what that place was like, to some old vernacular to be able to build authentically in that place, I think isn't necessarily helpful. But instead, the idea of understanding local climate and local materials and thinking about how we can build in a contemporary, diverse world in local place, in a way which is open and careful and kind and generous, seems important.
Important and incredibly difficult.
Yes, exactly.
Well, that's a great point to finish on. Adam, thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with me.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about this old book.
Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusions and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. That's from Wordsworth's Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey from 1798. I guess that chimes with the best of Heidegger, but in only 4.5 completely transparent lines. Thanks to Adam for speaking to me, and to Routledge for the PDF of the book. Please see the podcast description for links to the book and to Adam at work and in practice. And thanks for listening.